My name is Emma, and I work from home. I never thought I'd end up living in my in-laws' house, but life has a funny way of shifting your plans. It all started when my father-in-law Richard injured his back at work. He was always a hard-working man, but he overdid it and was forced into early retirement. His health declined quickly after that, and my mother-in-law Ruth was too frail to take care of him alone. That's when I stepped in. My husband Daniel and I moved into his parents' home to help them out. The house was huge, far bigger than I was used to, and it had an eerie, empty feeling to it. The place had been in Daniel's family for generations, and it showed. The wallpaper was peeling, the floorboards creaked, and there were entire rooms no one had entered in years. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I kept it to myself. Ruth was always a proud woman, even though she hadn't worked a day in her life. She often bragged about how well she and Richard had done for themselves. Daniel, too, seemed to have inherited some of that pride, even though his job didn't pay much. He was a freelance writer, struggling to make ends meet. Still, both of them acted as if they were above the rest of the world. It bothered me, but I kept quiet. After all, we were there to help, not to judge. Richard was different. He was quieter than the rest of the family, and I think he shared my discomfort with their arrogance. One day, as I was helping him get ready for bed, he confided in me. "I don't know how much longer I can keep going, Emma," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I've worked my whole life, and now I'm a burden. I can't even contribute financially anymore." I tried to comfort him. "You've done more than enough, Richard. Now it's time for you to rest. Let us take care of things." He smiled weakly, but I could see the pain in his eyes. I knew he felt guilty for not being able to provide for his family anymore, but I admired him for how much he cared. In contrast, Ruth and Daniel seemed to only care about appearances and keeping up their lifestyle. As time went on, Richard's condition worsened. He started losing weight and strength, and I insisted that we take him to the doctor. That's when we got the devastating news. Richard had cancer. The diagnosis hit all of us hard, but Ruth and Daniel's reaction shocked me the most. Instead of offering Richard comfort, they immediately asked the doctor how long he had left and how much the treatment would cost. I couldn't believe it. Here was a man who had sacrificed everything for his family, and all they cared about was money. Later that night, Richard pulled me aside. "They're waiting for me to die, Emma," he said, his voice low but firm. "They're more interested in my inheritance than my well-being. I know you've noticed it too." I had. Ruth had started acting like she was taking care of Richard, when in reality, she left most of the caregiving to me. She was always talking about how much everything cost, from the groceries to the medical bills. Daniel wasn't much better. He had started spending more time away from the house, working on his so-called writing projects, while I stayed behind to look after his father. Despite their coldness, I did everything I could to make Richard comfortable. We grew close in those last few months, and he often thanked me for staying by his side. But the tension in the house was palpable. Ruth and Daniel had become increasingly hostile toward me. They started accusing me of not contributing enough to the household, even though I was the one taking care of Richard and working from home to support us all. "You're just freeloading," Ruth said one night at dinner. "You sit around all day pretending to work while I have to manage this entire house." I was stunned. "I work from home, Ruth," I replied, trying to stay calm. "I'm also taking care of Richard while you're out shopping or meeting your friends." "Don't talk back to me," she snapped. "You've been living off our money since you moved in. If you're not careful, we'll send you packing." Daniel stayed silent through all of this, which hurt more than anything Ruth could say. I had hoped he would stand up for me, but instead he just stared at his plate, avoiding eye contact. Things got worse after Richard passed away. He had held on for as long as he could, but in the end, the cancer took him. I was devastated, but Ruth and Daniel didn't seem to grieve at all. They were too busy talking about the inheritance and how much they would get. A week after the funeral, Ruth barged into my room. "You need to leave," she said coldly. "You're no longer welcome here." I couldn't believe it. "What are you talking about? I haven't done anything wrong." "You've been taking money from this family," she hissed. "I know you and Richard were conspiring against us. He gave you money, didn't he? That's why you've been so eager to stay by his side." My heart raced. "That's not true. I never took anything from Richard." But she didn't believe me. "You need to go," she repeated, throwing a stack of papers at me. "Daniel wants a divorce and you're leaving with nothing." I stared at the papers in shock. Divorce? Daniel hadn't said a word to me about this. I thought we were in this together, but it seemed I was wrong. "Why didn't Daniel say this to me himself?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Because he's done with you," Ruth said, her eyes filled with disdain. "He's too busy with his career to deal with you anymore." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Daniel, the man I had loved and supported, was abandoning me just like that. I had no choice but to sign the papers. There was no point in fighting. I packed my things and left that night feeling utterly betrayed. A few weeks after I moved out, I received a frantic phone call from Daniel. "Emma, the money's gone," he shouted, his voice panicked. "All of it. You took it, didn't you?" I was stunned. "What are you talking about? I didn't take anything." But he didn't believe me. "You've been working with Dad this whole time, haven't you? You've been planning this." I tried to explain, but he hung up on me. I couldn't understand what was happening. I had never touched their money, so where had it gone? A few days later, I was summoned back to the house for a meeting about the inheritance. I didn't want to go, but I knew I had to clear my name. When I arrived, Ruth and Daniel were already there, along with a lawyer. The tension in the room was thick. The lawyer began reading Richard's will. As he went on, I could see Ruth and Daniel's faces growing pale. The majority of Richard's estate, including a large sum of money, had been left to me. I was in shock. I had no idea that Richard had planned this. Ruth exploded. "This is a mistake. That money belongs to us." The lawyer shook his head. "Richard made his wishes clear. Emma is the primary beneficiary." Daniel looked like he had been punched in the gut. "You manipulated him," he shouted at me. "You made him leave everything to you." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "I didn't do anything," I said, my voice trembling. "Richard made his own decisions." But they wouldn't listen. Ruth started crying, and Daniel just stared at me, his eyes filled with hatred. They couldn't accept that Richard had chosen to leave his money to me, the one person who had cared for him in his final days. As I left the house, I felt a strange mix of emotions. I hadn't expected any of this, and yet, in some way, I felt like I had done the right thing. Richard had trusted me, and I had honored that trust. But the story wasn't over yet. A few months later, I heard that Ruth and Daniel were struggling financially. Without Richard's money, they couldn't afford to keep up their extravagant lifestyle. They had to sell the house and move into a much smaller place. It seemed that their greed had finally caught up with them. One day, I got a call from a mutual friend. "Did you hear what happened to Ruth and Daniel?" she asked. "No," I replied, feeling a twinge of unease. "What happened?" "They were caught stealing from a local store," she said, her voice filled with disbelief. "Apparently they're in serious debt and resorted to shoplifting." I couldn't believe it. Ruth and Daniel, who had always prided themselves on their wealth and status, had sunk so low. It was hard to feel any sympathy for them after everything they had done, but a part of me still felt sad for how things had turned out. As I hung up the phone, I realized something important. I had spent so much time trying to please people who never cared about me, and in the end, it was my kindness and loyalty to Richard that had saved me. Ruth and Daniel had been consumed by greed, and it had destroyed them. Now, I live a quiet, peaceful life, free from the chaos of my past. I still think about Richard sometimes, and how he trusted me with his final wishes. I know he's at peace now, and I can finally move forward without looking back. As for Ruth and Daniel, their fate is sealed. Greed can destroy even the strongest of people, and in their case, it can